the closest our planet has to a world government, the United Nations opened this year's General Assembly a week ago. Now, in normal times, the main attraction of the General Assembly is the high-level debate that brings together heads of state and governments at the UN headquarters in New York. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, 173 world leaders this year are attending virtually to make their speeches. Now, in a time that requires more global coordination than ever, the theme of this high-level meeting this year is reaffirming collective commitment to multilateralism, clearly alluding to the current trends of nationalism and division we've been seeing around the world. So can the world pull together through this pandemic and beyond to create a collective, sustainable new normal? Today, we invite Oh Jun, former South Korean ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations from 2013 to 2016, who served as the 71st president of the Economic and Social Council. Welcome to the show, sir. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And, well, the UN actually, as you know, sir, it marked its 75th anniversary this year, celebrating the milestone on Monday. And, well, over the decades, the organisation has evolved from an institution for post-war peace and cooperation to one that pursues sustainable development and prosperity. So what major socio-economic milestones did you personally oversee during your time at the UN, especially as the president of the Economic and Social Council?
Well, when it comes to socio-economic milestones in the United Nations, I think the year 2015 stands out, not least because both the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on climate change were adopted in that year, by the world leaders during the last 4 months of the year. These two important, agreements were adopted. The SDGs were adopted by the General Assembly, not by the Economic and Social Council, which I chaired, but I held many meetings to facilitate the adoption process. And also I chaired the first review conference of the SDGs, which is called the High-Level Political Forum, or HLPF, in 2016.
Well, as you mentioned, sir, the world is pursuing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals for the year 2030. But reports say that the world was already off track by the end of 2019. Do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic could possibly undo the progress that has been made on poverty reduction, as well as improving health and well-being?
Well, undo is probably is too strong word, but where the United Nations SDGs report that came out this year was already saying that we are off track in achieving the SDGs even before the onset of the pandemic. So that is partly because the SDGs from the beginning are very ambitious goals. For example, if you look at SDGs, SDG 1 says, end poverty in all its forms, everywhere. It's not saying reduce poverty, it's saying end poverty. So can we really make the world totally free of poverty by 2030, which is only in 10 years' time? The SDGs were designed to encourage all countries in the world to pursue these ambitious goals so that they can make progress as much as possible, if not actually get there. But this pandemic crisis, unfortunately, has a huge negative impact on our efforts to achieve SDGs, to make progress on SDGs. And the impact is, unfortunately, all over the 17 goals.
And Ambassador, they say that this pandemic really doesn't discriminate and it's borderless. But, could it, though, worsen gaps within societies? Who are the most vulnerable?
Well, as you said, the pandemic doesn't discriminate. That's true. But its impact is more devastating on the vulnerable groups in our society, if you think about it. To put it simply, rich people, even if they stop working for several months, it's just that they cannot add to their existing wealth. But people who live from hand to mouth, this crisis poses a kind of existential threat to them. So addressing inequalities is a key rationale for the SDGs as embodied in SDG 10. And now, under the pandemic crisis, the level of inequality has to go fast. The UNDP recently said that the Human Development Index, which is a composition of education, health, and living standards, will fall for the first time since 1990 when they first started to measure them.
Well, looking forward to ensure that the post-pandemic new normal, as we say, is a sustainable one, as we hope. Then what issues do you think the UN and its member states should really prioritise at this point?
Well, talking about normal, actually, in a normal year, today would be the day when leaders of the world get together in New York and start their speeches, high-level speeches at the new session, as you earlier said. But this year, they are obviously doing that virtually by sending their video-recorded speeches. I hope that kind of contingency measure should not become a new normal. At the start of a new session last week, Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the virus is #1 global security threat in our world today. And he appealed again for implementation of his call made earlier this year for a global ceasefire. So all countries pay attention to peace, pay attention to defeating the virus, and shelve all the issues for a while. Likewise, I think for now the UN should rally around this critical task of defeating the virus, and deal with global problems later. A lot of global problems are waiting for us, so we can deal with that after defeating this pandemic, overcoming this pandemic crisis. So after that, we can deal with issues like inequality, racism, poverty, armed conflicts, and so on.
As you said, sir, the globe really needs to rally, but in the last few years, we've seen countries that were considered as pillars of global institutions and multilateralism rather radically backtrack from the major commitments that they made and instead pursue ultra-nationalism. And throughout this pandemic, we haven't seen the Security Council, for instance, play a leading role like they did during the MERS outbreak. And it's really hard to forget how it took weeks upon weeks for the WHO to declare COVID-19 a global pandemic. So would you say the UN is failing? Is it on its last legs? And why is multilateralism needed?
Well, that's exactly what makes us wondering and worried as well. Exactly when we need unity among nations, so that we can overcome our differences and come together to fight our common enemy, which is the coronavirus. But actually what we are doing is that we are fighting and blaming each other. Our countries are fighting and blaming each other. I think it is partly because of the fact that the pandemic hit the world when many countries were already suffering from problems such as economic recession. But it's also because some political leaders are taking care of their narrow political interests rather than what is needed for the whole world, for which I don't have any other word than populism.
And it's been quite a destructive force, as we have seen in recent years, populism. But well, just a few hours ago, President Moon Jae-in pledged that South Korea would be at the forefront of restoring multilateralism and green recovery in a speech, virtual speech, of course. Do you think then middle power countries like South Korea or Canada or Australia, for instance, have an opportunity to revive and lead multilateral efforts towards a sustainable future that the UN is looking at?
Yes, I think so. I think that is what is needed right now. If you think about it, the countries that are most negatively influenced by the pandemic shutdown are the ones whose dependency on foreign interaction, dependency on trade is high. such as South Korea and Canada, you just mentioned, large countries are usually more self-sustainable. So, as you said, middle powers should be more forthcoming and active in promoting multilateralism instead of unilateralism in addressing global issues.
And of course, the UN has long called for the improvement of human rights in North Korea, something that you've been working for many, many years. And well, over the course of the pandemic, the regime in North Korea has reported 0 cases of COVID-19 and has shrugged off offers of humanitarian assistance from both Seoul and Washington. But most international observers are very convinced and concerned that that's not really the case. So how devastating, Ambassador, would it be if the impact of the coronavirus, it hit the North Korean population?
Well, to be sure, North Korea can be no exception in terms of the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. As it is a very closed society, as we all know, we do not know how bad the impact has been. But we should remember that North Korea is among the poorest 30 countries in the world by any measurement, among 193 UN member states. So that means that the impact should be pretty bad. So the economic and social consequences of the pandemic crisis should be quite serious there as well. So they should accept humanitarian assistance from the international community, including from South Korea, before it is too late.
And of course, we have to think about the impact of the recent typhoons and the flooding that we've heard of recently. But well, there has recently been some criticism over the past 4 years that South Korea's Unification Ministry, for instance, hasn't published a report on North Korean human rights issues, and that the issue itself has been buried under the rather political peace agenda. So what are your thoughts on this issue?
Well, I can see that it is difficult for the South Korean government to deal with North Korean human rights issues while pursuing rapprochement with North Korea. What I think about this issue is that we need to take a more non-political approach as much as possible, which means that we deal with North Korean human rights issues purely based on human rights standards, rather than taking political approach. So in other words, turning a blind eye to North Korean human rights issue for fear of upsetting the North Korean regime is as political as using those issues to bash the Kim Jong-un regime. So my suggestion is that, while we are dealing with North Korea bilaterally, which is necessary, we shouldn't stop pressuring North Korea to change, especially through international organizations like the United Nations.
Well, I think that's a very important point you made, that human rights isn't a political issue, but it's a universal right for everyone on this planet, something that the UN is pushing for, of course. Well, we'll have to let you go now, but thank you so much for joining us this morning. That was Ambassador Oh Jun, Professor of United Nations Studies at Kyung University and former South Korean Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations. Again, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, thank you for watching. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow with an outlook on the world's economic recovery with an expert from the IMF. Have a great day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.